Welcome, USA Today bestselling author Jennifer Hilt. Yay!
Thanks for having me, Sarah.
I am so excited to talk to you. We kind of chit-chatted about it really quickly, but
Yeah.
I know tropes are such a hot topic, especially in the romance community, and everyone's always wanting to talk about tropes and always wanting to learn more about tropes. So, in case listeners don't know, can you tell them just a little bit about yourself and your writing?
Oh, sure. Well, I've written over 24 romances across 4 different subgenres using pen names, and I have an urban fantasy series out under my own name, The Undead Detective. I've also done plotting and concepting and working with romance authors, and that's really great because it's just kind of helped me learn how to explain how stories are put together. I have 2 other books in the Trope Thesaurus series. The first one is the Trope Thesaurus. The second is the Trope Thesaurus Horror, and then I'm having the romance one coming out in the next couple weeks or so through Kickstarter. And then my other ongoing project, I'll just sneak in there, is I'm co-writing a mystery series with my brother.
Ooh, fun. So what I'm hearing is there might be a mystery edition of the Trope Thesaurus eventually down the
I
line.
do believe so. Yes, I've already started scribbling and taking when I see something, I'm like, oh, that would be a good one to talk about, something on TV. So yeah, or a movie. So I'm excited to do that too.
Because I know when I was looking up to do an episode on tropes or talk more about tropes, I know I immediately found your Trope Thesaurus, which has been a huge game changer because you really went through a succinct way of breaking down the tropes and how they are utilized. Yeah, I just thought it was such a great tool to be utilized, especially for writers or readers to kind of hone in on some of these building blocks that we use in romance in particular.
Right. Yeah, I'm so glad. I had no idea when I wrote it, if it would be of any use to anyone. But like I said, in working with authors, I was noticing we needed to talk about tropes, but there's always I think less so now, but there's always a lot of shame about it. And so I started to think about, okay, so what does that mean? And it was I don't think it needs to go, it's like a big blanket that needs to cover the whole thing. Maybe tropes aren't the same as cliches or stereotypes. And how can we break that up so that we have usable things to work with and we don't have to worry about a lot of the other stuff? So that was but I didn't know if anybody else would find that useful. So it's been a really nice surprise that people have really liked it.
Well, and I think you had a perfect timing of when it came out because it's kind of been like a shift, it feels like, in the romance community in particular. Tropes are utilized so much now, even as part of the marketing, as part of your brand, as part of a selling point. Even during the blurbs, they'll call out tropes in particular to use it to
Yes.
get to their right audience.
Exactly. Yes. Yep. And I was working on it for a year before. And it was interesting. When I first started working on it, it was more, like I said, me having worked with other authors. But as I kept working on it, I was oh, I'm hearing about it more in the media, more in the mainstream, articles that I read that come across, on my phone will be talking about tropes. And it's just not even writing oriented, for TV shows and series. And so I agree, it's been a big shift in the last year of that word coming into the mainstream dialogue more.
It's so interesting to me because people are very passionate about their tropes, right? Readers, writers, just general audiences abroad, because it's one of those things of you love them or you hate them, or
Right.
there's kind of very little middle ground. So
Mhm.
why do you think people gravitate towards tropes so much?
Well, the thing that occurred to me when I was working on the horror book, which sounds funny, but I was realizing that tropes are really relationships. And that was so true when I was working in the horror genre, which totally surprised me. But I'm I think that's what people really want, is the relationship in the trope. And that's what they're saying when they I like X kind of story. And it just didn't occur to me before that's what it was. As you know, I love Secret Baby, but I also love twin stories. And so I was thinking, oh yeah, what is it? It's it's always the relationship between the twins. I always want a mistaken, I want one to be masquerading as the other and have that cause problems and those things like that. So it's really the relationships. I think if we can keep that in mind, it really will help build a strong story foundation by knowing our characters all need to interact.
Yeah, and that's a great way of framing it because there is a reason why everyone kind of loves tropes, right? And it keeps getting utilized over and over and over and over. So I like how you, in the book, the Trope Thesaurus romance, which again, you kind of mentioned is will kind of kick off a Kickstarter, right? On today, starting today. You break down tropes in 10 romance subgenres, but there are so many subgenres of romance and so many tropes. I mean, you mentioned some of them already a little bit, like the secret baby and the twins. Like, how did you choose which ones made it into the thesaurus?
Yeah, that was really tough because even as I was working on it, I was like, oh, I know I'm leaving like ones out I want to do, but I was like, at some point I gotta like wrap it up. And I was hoping that kind of in talking about it, people will see that there's really a lot are embedded with each other. So like, for example, paranormal romance, there can be a lot of elements of either a paranormal romance could be a fantasy one also, or it could be have elements of, contemporary. It's like where you're setting stuff. So I'm hoping that people will see that there's a lot of migration between them and that they're not like just the 10 separate genres. But I just kind of tried to go with what I see the most out there generally. Like I couldn't get into the like cowboy stuff, which is super popular. I just kind of went with what I see the most kind of out there that I was hoping to, authors would be like, oh, I want to write in this genre, or I do write in this genre. Let me get some take on what she's saying about it, just to kind of help boost ideas.
Well, and I love that you took that into consideration because I know one of the other ladies I talked to about tropes in particular, Amy Walker, who was also
Yeah,
on the podcast talking about tropes,
that's
she
awesome.
had mentioned, yeah, she said she was in the publishing industry for a while and she had started to notice this trend where tropes were starting to be layered on top of each other, kind of crossing genres a little bit, like mixing and matching. And
Mhm.
that's how authors were kind of presenting their stories now to readers in order to kind of differentiate themselves. So,
Yeah,
like, is that something that you've seen kind of as well? Like, and then you kind of took in consideration when writing the book?
well, to me, it seems like the tropes are generally like a base that can be used across, almost like colors in a paint box. I think
Mm.
about them. And if like say they're like watercolors. And so I think of tropes kind of like that, or as like Play-Doh, something that you can build with. And then I think about them as kind of blending them together and merging them together to create stories. So I totally see what she's saying about that with the publishing industry, because I think that's true that there is that readers are like, oh yeah, they're paying more attention to say, hey, this is an alpha male story, and things like that. But I just, for me, they're building blocks, and I think they can be honestly used. It doesn't have to just be in romance. I mean, these can be used in other genres too. But I'm just kind of focusing right now how romance authors would use them, just because with us, that is our main storyline, is the relationship between the main characters. And that's not true in other genres. So that's what makes romance special, is that we're really dealing with that relationship to start with, and then layering in like some subplots or other things underneath.
Absolutely. And we are all here for a good love story or a good relationship, right? That's
Right,
that's
right.
that's like the meat. That's the heart
Yeah.
of the story.
Exactly. Yeah. If I have to get on a plane and fly somewhere, it's like, oh, I am definitely taking a couple historical romances with me, because I want to be like completely as removed from the process as I can, squished in my seat, like escaping to another world.
That's exactly what I was talking about with somebody else too. I mentioned that romance is kind of like the comfort. It's kind of my comfort place. Like if I was traveling quite a bit for a period of like 3 or 4 months, I was going weekly,
Yeah.
traveling for work.
Mhm.
And I would always like bust out my Kindle and like have at least 2 or 3 romance books downloaded already, ready to
Right.
go. And I like as soon as I have get waiting for that plane, I am busting it out and I am reading.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. We're really so lucky with that whole ebook revolution, because before it'd be like, I was always thinking, I wish there was a word for like when you get on the plane and the books you've picked, you suddenly realize, oh God, these aren't the right ones. Like, I'm trapped on this plane. I have only these to read, and they aren't even what good or what I want. And so I was like, oh, then the ebooks came along and they've taken, away that problem. So we're really lucky in that way to have so much choice now.
Oh yeah. And with the rise of indie publishing, my goodness, it is just like booming with
Mhm.
just so many romances, so little time that I have. Just like
Yeah.
there's so many releasing, and then I still gotta, my TBR just keeps growing. And but
Yes.
I'm very thrilled. I'm very thrilled that there's so many people. It's made it so accessible. And even
Right.
tropes, you could even say that about tropes. Tropes have made a romance writing very accessible for people to be like, okay, that's definitely something I want to write about.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, and that's really something I think to thank our readers for, because I feel like this is a trend that really readers push, especially romance readers, because they've all along been like, I like X, Y, and Z. And then that's like funneled, I think, into other genres and stuff too. But like they're able to say, articulate better than in other areas of like, this is the real kind of relationship I want to read about. And so it's really us, I think, as authors, like, okay, let's give them what they want.
and I appreciate that as a reader. No two tropes are the same. Like there are all kinds of varieties. And I do think that there are new tropes coming up like every so often because I swear I see like new tropes kind of peeking their heads up and I'm just like, I haven't
Yeah,
seen that one yet, but that's interesting.
yeah, yeah.
So, and I know every author's process is different. How
Mhm,
did you approach analyzing each trope in the book?
mhm. Well, let's see. It is hard because they really overlap so much. So basically what I did is I took 60 tropes that are in romance, either as like kind of the primary tropes, like the ones we always think of, like love triangle or friends to lovers, um, or like alpha male, like we talked before, or bad boy. And then I also included in that more like plot-based tropes, like kidnap, revenge, just some, and I put them all together. And then I like watched a whole lot of romance, dug through a whole bunch of movies and books, and then and looked and just watched them to count and figure out, okay, how many tropes are in here, and then listing what they are for each one. You know, there's a lot of ones that like I picked a movie that I was highlighting that one trope, but there's like going to be 10 or 12 other tropes in it that could be also in another subgenre, like say Woman in Peril. There were a lot of stories, especially if you look at any kind of suspense storyline, that's a pretty popular trope. So it was just really, I really just wanted to show people, authors, it's okay to use a lot of tropes. You don't have to, because sometimes people are like, well, I want to use one or two and they're afraid. But when you start, really start to dig in and look at good stories and well-developed books, there are a lot of tropes in there. They're just very specialized to the story, so they don't pop out at you. But the base of letting the reader in on that relationship is still there. So that was kind of what I discovered by digging in and just watching a lot of movies, like I said, and reading, taking notes, took a lot of notes. But that was just basically my process. And it was really pretty exciting to see how great stories are put together, and how things remain popular year after year, because you're giving the audience what they want in terms of a story.
You bring up a really cool point too, because that's something I kind of noticed when I went into screenwriting in particular, and we had to analyze a lot of movies. Speaking
Mhm.
of which, so
Yeah.
we did something very similar where we had
Oh,
to kind of identify the three-act structure. And once you
oh,
see it,
great.
it
Yeah,
becomes really apparent, kind of.
right,
But like you said, it is specialized to that particular movie or that particular
right,
story or
right.
relationship. So
Mhm.
I'm kind of curious what your opinion is, or if you saw this very often, is I've noticed a lot of tropes being integrated into romance, into the book itself a lot of
Mhm.
times, but sometimes it doesn't make an appearance till like halfway through the book.
And I think that's totally great. We like when I read a book, I don't need to know on the first page what all the tropes are going to be for the book. I just need like little breadcrumbs of like, oh, those interest me, so I'm going to keep reading. And that's really like our job as authors, is to keep people interested all the way to the end. So it's not like we have to use these three tropes and we're going to harp on it again and again. It's great to use like maybe you have like three that'll be more main tropes, and then like you said in the middle, like, oh, I didn't know there was a secret. Now we're starting to hear about that. And the secret is one that kind of tends to pop up more in the middle or a little farther along in terms of creating good complications. But I think of it a little bit like shading. Like some tropes are going to be like brighter if you're like coloring with a crayon or something like that, and then some are just going to be lighter, just a little bit in there, but it helps still round out your character and push the story along. Like Jane Austen stuff. When I go back, hers are full of tropes, and yet they're popular, several hundred years later because it's relationships. It's all family relationships and romantic relationships, which we still all experience. And she has a lot of, some tropes in hers are more obvious than others, and so she does that too, where they're be sprinkled in a little bit along the way. So I'm totally for them showing up later, no problem.
No, and you make a great point as far as like the shading. Some are lighter, some are darker, and some tropes are more apparent than others, and some might, like gently make their way through some of the thread, as a thread throughout the book. I have noticed that more and more that the tropes are being layered on top of each other, but some are aren't apparent until later on.
Right. And what I think is so great about that is it's like a way that we can create more complex characters, because like we think about ourselves, like there's parts of us that are like more apparent and parts of us that are like, kind of more hidden or less, depending on the situation, will come out. And that's really what we're trying to do with our characters, or create those same kind of situations where they're not acting the same all the time. We don't see the same parts of them all the time. They adjust just like we do. So that's what I think the neat thing about tropes is, it offers us an opportunity to okay, who else is this person? And then think about it. Think, okay, what are some other options about who they are?
That's probably one of my favorite parts of tropes, is because it adds such a depth to the characters themselves, depending on how they react within certain trope situations, or what kind of tropes are being applied to them. So you create some great insight and prompts for goal, motivation, and conflict. Yeah, absolutely. In your the Trope Thesaurus romance book, and how it kind of relates to the tropes for a romance character in particular. So why do these three major factors, the goal, motivation, and conflict, how do they relate to tropes, and how can that help authors build a great romance?
Yeah, that's a great question. What I found in working with other authors too was that it's hard to just develop a trope on its own. But I found that if I did them with goal, motivation, and conflict, kind of like seesawing back and forth, then it helped build more concrete structures into it. So you're going to take a character and you're going to give her three tropes. Like, say she could be, do you have a book or movie in mind that you wanted to talk about?
Have you seen The Lost City? That one was pretty cute. Just came out with Sandra Bullock.
That's a great one, because there were so if we think about her character, she's definitely the woman in peril, and she definitely was very much like the boss. And what else would I say about her?
I was thinking Grumpy Sunshine,
yes,
because she was the grump, and I love that.
Yes, she definitely was. Yeah. So she has those three aspects of her personality. So Alan was very much the protector, but he also was, I also loved that he had this nurturing soft side. I liked that he was like a warrior, but not super alpha, even though his physique would be what we would think of as and that's what he's known for from that first scene in the romance convention, which was pretty funny. I think with him, it was kind of almost boy next door, because she just didn't really take him very seriously. And he was always, trying to have her do that. Sandra Bullock. So her goal pretty soon is to escape and to get out of there. But she also needs to find that the lost city, or that crack that code. And so those are two very we're going to either know if she's cracked that code or if she's escaped. Those are what I mean by making goals measurable. And obviously they're meaningful, because the antagonist was supposedly threatening her life, which I had trouble taking him super seriously, but but that was kind of the setup for that. And then her motivation is to be free. And then the conflict is she has no skills that translate into finding her way through the jungle. And she had done anthropology, but with her husband, and it wasn't like she has all these physical skills to navigate. So that would be kind of how I would set that up with looking at goal, motivation, and conflict, and then just kind of threading it back and forth with the tropes that we talked about of like, what did we say, women in peril, the grumpy sunshine, which I also kind of think of as alpha hole, where, you know, it's kind of like she's the bossy person and that grumpiness. So I just kind of keep working at it like that, and like adding different layers of the personality into how I'm trying to do the goal, motivation, and conflict. And the same thing with Alan, of like, he's trying to free her, but also get her to like notice him as a man and then love interest. So this kind of, okay, that's his challenge, is to be working against those two things.
Well, and I know we mentioned kind of a little bit earlier, like I see new tropes, but I think they're just named tropes. When I thought of Alan, I thought of him as what they call a himbo now, or golden retriever energy.
Oh, I like that.
But like, I
Great.
thought it was, yeah. And I was just like, that kind of fits him, because that's something he was very, you know, he seemed really kind of, you know, a little dim, but like really lovable, and like just wanting to do the right thing. And he was so sensitive and almost a little bit of a cinnamon roll too. You bring up an awesome point that I just thought of just now when you mentioned it, was she's trying to escape her current predicament, but that could be taken both ways, because she's trying to escape, obviously, the, you know, the Daniel Radcliffe bad guy, big baddie of the movie, but then she's also trying to escape her contract out of writing these books, because she does not want to write them anymore. She's not motivated. She's lost her love of it. She's not inspired anymore, and she's just kind of sick of it. So I love that you could use like both of those to kind of mirror throughout and it kind of did. It kind of mirrored throughout the movie, that not only was she trying to physically escape, but she was trying to emotionally and mentally escape things that were weighing on her.
Right. And that's what great stories do, is like, you don't see it right off the bat. You know, you're just sucked in. And then later, when you think about it, like we just did, because this was an example I talked about in the book. It's like, oh, then you start to see like all this structure they built in, but it doesn't like come at you super apparently when you're watching it or reading it, which is what makes a really engaging story.
Well, you mentioned something that like blew my mind, because talking about Sandy Bullock, because that is my default when I think of rom-coms. But like you mentioned While You Were Sleeping, one of my favorite movies of one of my favorite rom-coms of all time. Like it was playing nonstop at my house. My mom loves it. So like all the time growing up. But you mentioned it was like it was basically a Rapunzel retelling. And that blew my mind, because I didn't even think about it until you mentioned it in the book. And I was like, oh my goodness. I was like, OMG.
Like, good. Well, I'm glad it wasn't just me, or it made sense.
I see it. Like, I totally see it now without like you having to say anything else. And that's a very clever way of integrating those tropes without really outright, like you said, outright saying it, or like kind of being really clever about it to where it serves the story and the characters.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, no, I was thinking of that too. Like, wow, this is like, you know, and studying it, I'm like, wait, this is actually just like Rapunzel, but she's in, you know, a transit booth, you know, and it was just kind of really funny to realize that and wonder, like, how did they pitch that? Did they think of that themselves? But you know, you have then, if you use something like Rapunzel, then they had the basis for a very popular, well accepted story that people, you know, like again and again. So it was really clever how they did it.
I love when people like integrate it, like you said, in just very non-distinct ways. Like they're in there, but you don't really see it until you really examine it. You know, it's just kind of subconsciously. And a lot of times that's why we love these stories, is because a lot of times it is the same story over and over and over, but just told differently or repackaged.
Right. Yeah. And it still has like this emotion, and we still have this emotional connection with it. And I think that's the thing that makes it worth telling again in different ways. Like, I know it's an older example, but I loved the Bridget Jones Diary, because it was Pride and Prejudice, which I also loved, but yet like, you know, updated and added some other stuff. And it was just like, oh, so clever how she did it. And, you know, it's still, I had obviously rewatched it for this. It's like, oh, it's still good.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I didn't even know like that was a retelling until until I was much older and I had kind of examined, like I said, we're talking about screenwriting. They were like, oh yeah, and by the way, Clueless is a Emma retelling. And I'm just like, wait, what?
Yes,
Excuse me?
yes, yes.
Just
Right,
but
right.
it totally makes sense because Jane
Yeah.
Austen she was amazing at that. She was a, masterclass basically of
Yeah.
like how you utilize tropes and making these connections that, like you said, centuries later, people are still connecting to.
Absolutely. And I really, one of my favorite books of hers is Persuasion, which they did a remake this summer, which on Netflix, which was very pretty, but it wasn't like this, for me, it wasn't the same as the book. But what I love about that book is that is just all relationships with her family and how she has this like second chance. And it's still just one of my favorites. I hope that there's like a newer remake that kind of mirrors more what all the conflict that she had in there. But Dakota Johnson, yeah, I still like her. And it's just like to escape into that world is always pleasurable.
It is. And you mentioned something that like that's what got me, especially as someone who's written screenplays or who's taken classes. And that's something that I actually talked to another romance podcaster about was specifically the movie Persuasion, why it was so divisive for people. And my takeaway was that it was audience expectations, which I think leads right into tropes. When you're using certain tropes, there are certain types of expectations readers have of that trope. And when you subvert it too much away from what that trope is, I feel like you lose the audience.
I think that's really true. I think, especially with Persuasion, I think in a lot of ways that is an ugly duckling story for Anne, the protagonist. And not in a physical way, although it's kind of interesting that as she comes into her own, people are like, wow, you're really looking good, but when she was just, kind of exhausted and not appreciated. And I think part of that journey for her kind of coming into her own and feeling like she has some agency in her life, the Netflix, that they didn't translate that. The actress was already more empowered in a way in the beginning, so we didn't get that whole transformation. And I think, at least for me, that was part of it, because I was like, oh, it's kind of if you're familiar with the story, it's very crucial to that story. So
that was my biggest critique of the film, was the fact that she was very, like you said, empowered. Because when I read the book, it's kind of a downer. It's very melancholy.
It is.
And
Yeah.
it's not, but like with the film, it was more, it was more definitely like girl power, kind of like I kind of do my own thing and that's fine. And that was not the essence I got from the book. So it was a very different view of it, not necessarily a bad view, but just definitely different from what I think we had expected especially going into it.
Exactly. Yeah. I think it could have been a perfectly fine film if it wasn't called Persuasion. I would have enjoyed it much better.
That was exactly what I said, because that was something the romance podcaster, Poppy, she had asked me about it. She said, what was something they could have fixed about it? I said, they could have easily fixed it. All they had to do was change the name.
Yes,
they didn't have to do anything else. All they had to do was say it was a historical romance and change the name and just say it was loosely based. Loosely based on Jane Austen's Persuasion.
Yep. I totally agree. Yeah. When I watched it, my husband was like, when I came out of the room, he was like, so, because he knows it's one of my favorite books. And I was like, it was an entertaining movie if they just hadn't called it same thing, if they just gave it a different title. But I think maybe the other thing about it is it's that journey that we want to go on with the characters. And because the book is such a downer, but we're also pulled along in Anne coming into the light. And that was, I think, lost in how, they tried to do it. So that was probably one reason why people like you and I are like, oh, we wished they had kind of stuck to that a little more.
Exactly. And you do use a lot of examples of movies in your book. Was that always kind of the idea, was to make sure we use something more recognizable for some people?
Yes, because it's just, there's so many great books out there, but it's just so hard because of all the things that we have coming at us, finding examples that people are familiar with. And I was afraid if I used a whole bunch of books, then it's like people are like, oh, I got to go read that. Oh, I got to go read that. And I wanted to use stuff that was like, even if you haven't seen it, you just from being in our culture, you generally have the idea of I think with all of these. So you'll be like, oh yeah, okay, so I can dip into that and see how that trope worked in that particular story, but I don't have to go and sit and watch, 60 movies or TV shows or read books or something, because who has time for that with trying to get their own work done?
And I do think it is a lot less of an investment to ask somebody to watch like an hour and a half, maybe, of
Right.
like a show or or even a movie, as opposed to like 8 hours with a book.
Exactly. Yeah. And you can multitask of like having it on while you do something else. And yeah.
True. But I will say audiobooks are amazing too. Like if I have to do chores, I will throw on an audiobook in a
Yes.
heartbeat.
Yes.
And tropes, kind of like I mentioned, seem to be ever evolving. Like new terminology, seems like there are new tropes every single time I turn around. So you provide great takeaways in your book by mentioning ways writers can implement the tropes more effectively in their work. Like I noticed you had all kinds of prompts and things like that of how to structure out something for the goals and motivation and the conflict. So, which was so cool. And so what's one of the more inventive ways you've seen, like maybe writers use tropes in romance, or ways that you would suggest using tropes in romance?
I think the most important thing is to remember like what genre you're working in, and to be aware of that, because you do have to meet the reader expectations. And so like I think that's just the most important thing for people to keep in mind of in terms of like, okay, if I'm writing a contemporary, this is what it needs, and versus if I'm writing a sweet romance, there could be a very big difference in like heat level and in terms of like other characters. So I think that's the most important thing, is to like know your genre. You can always bend the rules, but you need to know what they are first. and that's just really an important thing I want people to keep in mind. There's so many great examples. I was thinking, this is an example that's in the book, but it was something that I was thinking about lately, is Ali Wong, their friends.
Always Be My Baby?
Yes,
Is that it?
yes, exactly. Yes. And I thought like that was, I liked that as an example of it. It has some similarities, I guess, with The Lost City in terms of having a very like strong female character. But what I liked about it was the male character was a strong character, but he was also kind of the beta kind of guy, but he wasn't like so beta that you were like, oh, I don't think I really like. No, he's like a musician, and he's just like super cute, and he fight Keanu Reeves. There's like great things about. But I think that was a movie that did a nice example of taking tropes and twisting them, and it was a contemporary love story, but there was like involvement of family behind it, so you could see those kind of tropes, but kind of twisting it in a different way. Instead of having a more conventional story, would have had him kind of be the successful person coming into the relationship, and her being somebody who maybe had stayed at home and not moved on after the death of a parent. But the way they switched it so that he was the one who had trouble moving on, and she was the one out in the world. It was like, oh, okay, I thought they did a really nice job on that. So you can do those kind of things when you know what the expectation is. And that movie did a great job of showing him coming into his own and being supportive of her in the end, and being emotionally involved with him, and not just kind of keeping herself closed off.
That's a perfect way to kind of bring light to that kind of question, is because I have noticed that too, is a lot of times where we would think, what is the traditional romance, male or female, or even non-binary now,
Right.
a role that that we would assign someone, like the grumpy sunshine. Usually the man's the grumpy, the woman's the sunshine. And I've seen a lot of this trope is still there, but it's reversed in books a lot now. I'm seeing like the women's more the grump, and now the guy's more the sunshine, which I think is adorable.
Yeah, it's great to see new things like freshen it up.
That is a great tactic to use, or to think about. If you're like, I want this trope, but I don't know if I want it in the traditional sense that people have known it to be. So how do I make it more lively? How do I make it more tailored to my story in particular?
And the other thing I think it's important for authors to try to remember is we can use them for secondary characters. So it's not only the main characters who are going to get tropes, but secondary characters, especially for romance authors. I think it's super important because we all love series. So if you can plant like, those in with the secondary characters, especially if they're going to appear in other books, it's really a great way to get people hooked into like, oh, I want to read, because we've all had those books, right, where you're reading and I'm like, oh, you like this one, but I really want to read, X's story. And so I think that's just a good thing to keep in mind, is that we don't just need to keep them for the main characters.
Listen, if you give me a feisty sidekick character in any novel, I will immediately want to see a story for that.
Yes, exactly.
What a great little nugget too, like to say to romance writers that, hey, you want to kind of spiral this into a series, or if that's something you would like to try to do, here's a great way to do it. Like instill a trope into some of your side characters and kind of weave that into your story. You have a place to go with a lot of the series.
Yeah, and that's what we're always trying to, is authors, we're always trying to find like a toehold into a story, I think, because you have an idea, but it's like either it's so overwhelming, you have so many ideas, or you're trying to develop the ideas. Either way, it's a struggle to kind of get into like, okay, how am I going to form this? So that's really what I'm hoping, that people can use tropes to help them when they're like, I don't know where to go next. I was hoping it would make it easier for people with using goal, motivation, and conflict, and pairing that with tropes to give them like a base for when you're stuck.
I love that, because that's something actually I just didn't think of till now, that we helped to brainstorm one of my girlfriends, one of her books with her. Like, and that's what we ended up doing, is we ended up giving her a trope. It was actually a little bit of the amnesia trope. How do I make it to where this guy who had a kid for like 10 years ago with this woman, they had a one night stand, and how do I make it to where he never knew about her, the kid, even though she told him? And I was just like, well, maybe he was just too drunk to remember. She did tell him, but he was too drunk, and he thought it maybe was like a dream or just like a figment of his imagination. Yeah. And that's how we integrated it into the story. And it worked.
I feel like amnesia, I talked about it a lot in the Trope Thesaurus horror, because it's this, I feel like the amnesia trope is like one of the least developed ones, because there's so much that you could actually do with it, because I think that it can be used for like dreamlike stuff too. And so it's a way to like communicate like other things with the characters without having to necessarily go through the whole relationship. Like, for the example I was thinking of was Charlaine Harris. I loved her Suki Stackhouse series. And she does, like, I think it was book 5. She does, Eric gets amnesia. Eric, the awesome vampire, gets amnesia, and he becomes a different person, more like sensitive. And so we get to see that with him and Suki, but then he ends up losing. He's had a spell on. So he's had this amnesia, doesn't know who he normally is, but then he reverts to the old Eric in the end. And so it's like, oh, that was so clever of her, because she gives us what we kind of want and a little taste of it, but then takes it away. And then we're like, okay, well, now what's going to happen? I have to read the next book. So there's a lot of ways that you can use it to kind of push the storyline along like that. And it doesn't have to be the whole thing. It can help your friend. It can help out tough spots. So, I mean, there's like a lot of stuff that's embedded in there without saying, oh, here's like the 5 ones that we brainstormed about, but yet it's helped to push her story along.
Speaking of which, you pull from so many great examples for tropes,
both
in books and movies. Like you were just throwing them out just now, being able to identify them, and you cover a lot of territory. I can only imagine how long it took you to research so many tropes. Did it take you a long time?
Yes, it did. Yes, I started it last March, and honestly, I did the horror Trope Thesaurus as like a break in between, but I've really spent so much time working on this in the last, we're into February now, and it's going through final proofreading. So yeah, it did take me a really long time. But I felt like it needed to be really thorough, because I wanted authors to like be able to look at it and see all the things that have been done with tropes and feel like empowered and energized to do that with their own work. And so it ended up taking longer than I had anticipated, but I'm hoping that, that time was well spent and helps people in their journey.
Oh, I think it will. I think it'll be invaluable to any romance writer or even romance reader in order to talk more more succinctly to their audience and saying like, okay, these tropes were used for
Mhm.
like this type of book. It allows you a better way to identify, right? All those relationships, all those connections and
Mhm.
how they're used.
I think the critical thinking part is like something that we as romance writers can totally embrace and still tell good stories, but just kind of like being aware of the components that we're using.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that is such a great method. And like I said, that's why I was so thrilled when I found your Trope Thesaurus like a year ago, when I kind of first really putting out content for my podcast, because I was just like, everyone wants to talk about tropes. Somebody help me talk about tropes. And I think you did a great job because
Oh, thank
you
you.
found something that people are really passionate about and trying to navigate, even
Mhm.
as writers and even like marketers. Like I said, I've keep getting one sheets from different authors and they're selling themselves by saying like, these are the types of books I write and they're tropes.
Mhm.
So,
I know it's
and
very, very amazing. Yeah.
isn't it just incredible? Now, would you recommend writers watch or read other books or movies using their preferred tropes in order to kind of maybe broaden their horizons?
Absolutely. It doesn't have to be even in the genre that you're writing or using. Sometimes I find it easier, like when I'm working on something, I don't try to read or watch in that genre. I need to do something else to kind of give my brain a break. But I think that that can be easier to spot tropes is in unfamiliar settings. So like say if you're a fantasy writer, check out some things that are going on in contemporary or romantic suspense. And so I think that just thinking about what you're reading and watching, it becomes like a game of like picking it out. And it's fun too, because like I will watch something and just enjoy it. And then in the end, I'll be like, okay, oh yeah, it had, all these things in it. And the really good stuff is like, you have to think about it because they've really just embedded it organically into stories. So, some are become more or easier to pick out than others, but it doesn't matter as long as the story is well told and, you're engaged or the person who's watching it is engaged.
Some ways to maybe even think about it too would be like maybe take your favorite movies or
Mhm.
books and kind
Mhm.
of reverse engineer it and say, okay, well, what kind of tropes are they using
Yes,
and how? And maybe
exactly.
that can figure out like what kind of tropes you tend to gravitate to.
And if there's a trope that that you're struggling with, like amnesia, like that was one that I've always been curious about. And then I really spent a lot of time in the Trope Thesaurus horror talking about it because the show Severance came out last spring, and I
Ooh,
was like
yes.
completely obsessed with that show. And I watched it, and so I'm like, again, I'm working on all this romance stuff, so I was like, I need to do something else. So I found that show, and I was just like totally just nuts about it. But I was watching it, quite a ways for somebody who's doing this. And I was like, oh, it's a twist on the amnesia trope. Like starting out watching it, I was just totally sucked in. I wasn't thinking that, but it was such a clever way that they did it. So it can be helpful to look at things in different lights and how people develop things. So I think this being mindful of kind of what's going on in the storytelling world is always good.
And you speak of that. And I actually recently talked to a cozy mystery writer who
Oh,
spoke like all about how romance plays a subplot in the cozy mystery series.
it
Now, it
does.
isn't the main plot because then that's romance.
Right.
But again, audience expectations of the
Yes.
genre. She specifically used a love triangle in her
Oh.
books.
Mhm.
Can your Trope Thesaurus romance edition apply to anyone who might include a romance in their book?
Oh yeah, definitely. I just tried to talk about romance as like the main storyline, but there's
Mhm.
so many examples when you look at movies and things like that of how, oh, that could have been, you could have flipped it and done it the other way. But yes, I don't think it has to just be, for romance writers, as long as you're writing a relationship story, I think there's a lot of tropes that can be worked into to how that relationship is developed. Because like one thing that I think is important that it took me a while to figure out, but so say for example, enemies to lovers is always a really popular trope. That's not the end of the story. You don't just write enemies and they become lovers. It's like you need to have the whole arc of like, oh, they start off, hostile to each other, but then they end up together. So how scene wise do we get from A to like B?
Mhm.
So I feel like that's the part that's like, okay, really need to like break that down and think of how to build the relationships. So that's something that I've been working on now I'm putting together a workbook, and I'm going to like talk in that about how to build scenes using tropes.
Oh, I'm so excited about that because I know that you, in the book in particular, the Trope Thesaurus romance, that you had kind of laid out these examples of what we could do to really utilize those tropes. So I was kind of hoping you would have some kind of workbook or worksheet.
Yes,
I could play with.
Like the 6 steps to outlining is in the Trope Thesaurus romance. Done in the workbook part, I'm going to have like these 5 points to how to structure a scene using tropes. So I'm hoping that using the 2 of them will help people like feel like, okay, I have a way to like get my story moving or get unstuck.
What a great tool too for like writers, especially if they're like trying to plot out anything as far as a book or a series. I know we've talked all about tropes today, like all about romance tropes, about the Trope Thesaurus romance. So where can listeners find your books and how can they connect with you?
Oh, thank you. They can find my books. My books are available wide. And if you go to my website at www.jenniferhilt.com, you'll see you can be directed to those venues. And then the Trope Thesaurus romance, I'm doing a Kickstarter on, and it starts today. And that you can find out from my website too, of like how to see what's available there. I've got an audiobook version, the print copy, ebook copy, and I'm doing some classes, and then the workbook will be available through there too. And I just wanted to say one thing that wasn't with your talking to the cozy writer. What I think is really interesting about cozies, what I've noticed when I've looked at them myself, is that it's the relationship, right? Like you come to read the mystery, but it's the relationship of what's going to happen with her in that love triangle that keeps you coming back book after book, I think. So I think it's a really clever way to use romance, is really the hook.
No, and that's actually a great call out because in that episode, Amber Royer, who was the cozy mystery writer, she had mentioned she's an instructor herself, a writing instructor, and she had told me that that was an audience expectation, was to have some kind of small piece of romance in there in cozy mysteries, but it helped keep the tension with the kind of who's she going to choose. And she said she noticed a specific drop off once you kind of give that main protagonist their romance, there is a drop off of readership because you've already given, you've kind of given her that romance. And so like, hey, yeah, that's awesome. We came from the mystery too, but we want to see the community building and all those relationships.
Absolutely. Yeah. I noticed, at least for me, I really loved the show Longmire. And I was like, realized I'm watching the show because I want to know, is he going to wind up with the deputy? I mean, yeah, there's mystery, but that's what I want to know.
Right. I'm the same way. If I find like 2 characters have chemistry, even if it's like not at all a romance show or movie, I'm just like, but will they end up together is all I need to know.
I need to know. I know. Exactly.
So yeah, great way to thread that out, because she had said that she had kind of tracked that out over several books because she knows she wanted to keep that tension.